Ruth looked left and right to be sure she was alone. Then she brought down the pot of soup from the stove, raised her skirt, and urinated into the soup Ruth had been living and working for the Smith family for the past few years, and they had been nothing but nice and loving towards her. But Ruth felt jealousy and anger towards them. There lived a kind woman named Mrs. Angela and her husband, Mr. David. They had three lovely children, Bella, James, and little Tommy, who was just 4 years old. Their home was filled with love, laughter, and warmth. Mrs. Angela was known for her generosity and treated everyone in her household with care, including her house help. Ruth was an 18-year-old girl from a small rural community. After losing her parents at a young age, she struggled to survive until Mrs. Angela offered her a place in her home. Ruth was given a room, a salary, and the promise of an education. Mrs. Angela treated her more like a family member than an employee. She ensured Ruth ate the same meals as everyone else, wore clean clothes, and even joined them for family outings. Ruth, this is your home too, Mrs. Angela would say warmly. You're part of this family. I don't want you to feel left out. At first, Ruth felt grateful for the kindness she received. She had heard countless stories from other housemaids about strict employers who mistreated them, so living with the Smiths felt like a dream come true. But as time passed, envy began to creep into her heart. She watched how Mrs. Angela's children hugged and laughed with their mother, how Mr. David would come home with gifts for his family, and how everyone doted on little Tommy Ruth, felt like an outsider. One evening, Ruth overheard a conversation between Mrs. Angela and her sister, Aunt Linda, in the kitchen. Angela, you're too soft on that girl, Aunt Linda said in a sharp tone. You shouldn't treat her like one of your own. These housemaids are better handled with a firm hand. If you're not careful, she'll forget her place. Mrs. Angela sighed and shook her head. Linda, I don't want to be cruel. She's just a young girl who has been through so much. How can I treat her any differently? Ruth stood quietly behind the door, listening. Aunt Linda's words stung, but what hurt more was Mrs. Angela's kindness. Ruth didn't understand why she felt this way, but a seed of resentment had been planted in her heart. The next morning, while helping Mrs. Angela set the table for breakfast, Ruth accidentally spilled some juice. It's okay, Ruth, Mrs. Angela said gently, handing her a towel. Mistakes happen. Just be careful next time. But Ruth saw the disapproving glance Aunt Linda gave her from across the room. That glance stayed with her all day, feeding the jealousy that was beginning to grow. The days turned into weeks, and Ruth's feelings of envy deepened. She couldn't stop comparing herself to Mrs. Angela and her family. Her gratitude turned into bitterness, and soon she began to resent the very people who had shown her love. One evening, as she prepared the family's dinner, a dark thought crossed her mind. It was something she had never imagined herself capable of doing, but the envy in her heart made her act impulsively. She looked at the pot of soup on the stove, hesitated for a moment, then did something unthinkable. Her actions were driven by jealousy, but Ruth had no idea how much her decision would change everything in the Smith household. The next morning, the family gathered around the dining table as usual. Bella, James, and Tommy chattered happily about the day ahead. While Mrs. Angela served the soup, Ruth stood nearby, her heart pounding with guilt and fear. She kept her head down, hoping no one would notice her unease. As everyone began eating, Mrs. Angela paused, her spoon hovering in the air. Mid-air, she frowned slightly and sniffed her soup. Is it just me, or does this soup taste strange? She asked. Glancing around the table, Mr. David raised an eyebrow. Strange? I think it tastes fine, he replied, taking another spoonful. Bella, always the picky eater, wrinkled her nose. It's a little weird, Mom, like it's off or something. James shrugged. Tastes normal to me. Mrs. Angela took another cautious sip, her frown deepening. She turned to Ruth. Ruth, did you follow the recipe I gave you? Ruth nodded quickly, her voice trembling. Yes, ma'am. I did everything exactly as you said. Mrs. Angela gave her a long, searching look. but didn't press further. All right, maybe it's just my taste buds acting up. The rest of the meal passed uneventfully, but Ruth could barely breathe. She kept expecting someone to figure out what she had done, to call her out, to send her away in shame, but no one did. That night, Ruth lay awake in a small room, staring at the ceiling. She felt a mix of emotions: relief that she hadn't been caught, guilt for what she had done, and an unsettling satisfaction at having acted on her envy. She told herself it was a one time thing, a moment of weakness she wouldn't repeat. But deep down, she knew the resentment in her heart was far from gone. The next morning, Ruth went about her chores as usual, but the air in the house felt heavier. Mrs. Angela's usual warm demeanor had been replaced with a quiet reserve. She observed Ruth more closely, though she didn't say anything. The children, unaware of the tension, carried on with their playful banter. Bella, the eldest, asked Ruth to braid her hair before school. Ruth, can you make my hair into two puffs today? My friends at school said it looks really nice on me, Bella said cheerfully. Ruth forced a smile. Go and get the comb. When Bella returned and sat down, Ruth yanked at her hair harder than necessary, ignoring the little girl's whines. Ruth, it hurts, Bella cried. Sit still. You're too old to be whining like a baby, Ruth snapped, her voice harsher than usual. James and Tommy looked up from their breakfast. Surprised, Ruth had never spoken to Bella that way before. Bella bit her lip and tried to hold back tears, but the rough handling continued. By the time Ruth finished, Bella's scalp was sore, but she said nothing. Later that afternoon, while Mrs. Angela and Mr. David were out running errands, Ruth's resentment surfaced again. James had been playing with Tommy in the living room when Tommy accidentally knocked over a glass of water on the coffee table. Look what you've done, Ruth scolded, glaring at Tommy. I'm sorry, Ruth, Tommy said in his small voice, his eyes wide with fear. Sorry doesn't clean this up, Ruth snapped. She handed James a rag. Clean it up, and if it happens again, both of you won't eat dinner tonight. James frowned. But it wasn't me. I said clean it up, Ruth barked, cutting him off. James reluctantly obeyed, and Tommy stood beside him, tears streaming down his cheeks. When Mrs. Angela returned home later, Ruth's tone shifted immediately. She became polite, even cheerful, and carried Tommy in her arms as though nothing had happened. Everything went fine, Mom, Ruth said with a smile as Mrs. Angela walked in. The kids behaved themselves. Mrs. Angela nodded, but Bella's downcast expression didn't escape her notice. Bella, is everything all right? She asked gently. Bella hesitated, glancing at Ruth, who gave her a warning look. Yes, Mom, Bella muttered, but Mrs. Angela's intuition told her something was wrong. A few days later, Ruth's actions grew bolder. While the children played outside, James accidentally tripped over Ruth's broom as she swept the front porch. Are you blind? Ruth snapped, pulling him roughly to his feet. I didn't see it. I'm sorry, James said, brushing dirt off his clothes. Sorry doesn't fix anything. Next time watch where you're going or you'll regret it, Ruth hissed, pushing him towards the yard. Bella, who had been watching from a distance, clenched her fists. She wanted to tell her mother what was happening, but she was too scared. That evening, as Mrs. Angela tucked Bella into bed, she noticed the little girl's red, puffy eyes. Bella, you can talk to me, Mrs. Angela said softly, stroking her daughter's hair. If something is bothering you, you have to let me know. Bella hesitated, then shook her head. It's nothing, Mom. But Mrs. Angela wasn't convinced. She decided to keep a closer eye on Ruth, determined to get to the bottom of whatever was troubling her children. One Saturday morning, while the family was out grocery shopping, Ruth prepared lunch at home. She cooked the food with her usual efficiency, but her mind wandered to the resentment she felt toward the family. Why did they have so much love? Why was she always on the outside looking in? When the family returned and gathered around the table, Ruth watched them laugh and chat as they ate. Her jealousy burned brighter than ever, and she found herself wondering how much longer she could stay in a home where she felt like a shadow. The following week, Mrs. Angela began to notice small changes in the household. Bella was quieter than usual. James avoided Ruth whenever he could, and little Tommy, who adored everyone, now seemed uneasy around her. Something was wrong, and Mrs. Angela's intuition wouldn't let her ignore it any longer. One evening, while Ruth was cleaning the living room, Mrs. Angela decided to test her instincts. She sat on the couch and called Bella to sit with her. Bella, I've noticed you've been a little down lately, Mrs. Angela began gently. Is there something you want to tell me? Bella hesitated, glancing nervously toward the kitchen where Ruth was. No, Mom, I'm fine. Mrs. Angela leaned closer and held Bella's hand. You know you can tell me anything, right? Whatever it is, I won't be upset with you. Bella's lips trembled and she looked down. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. Hearing this, Mrs. Angela felt her heart sink. She pressed further. Is it Ruth? Bella's head shot up in surprise, but she didn't answer. Instead, she nodded hesitantly. What did she do? Mrs. Angela asked softly, keeping her tone calm. She's mean when you're not around, Bella whispered. She pulls my hair and she yelled at James and Tommy. She said, we won't eat dinner if we make mistakes. Mrs. Angela's chest tightened. She fought to keep her expression neutral, not wanting to alarm Bella further. Thank you for telling me, sweetheart, she said, hugging her daughter. I'll take care of it. That night, as the children slept, Mrs. Angela confided in her husband David. I think there's more going on with Ruth than we realize, she said. What do you mean? Mr. David asked, setting down the book he was reading. Bella told me that Ruth has been mistreating the kids when we're not around, she explained. And now I'm starting to wonder if her attitude has anything to do with the strange taste in the soup last week. Mr. David frowned. Are you saying she might be sabotaging the food? I don't know, Mrs. Angela admitted, but something isn't right. I'm going to keep an eye on her, and I think it's time we have a serious conversation. The next day, Mrs. Angela stayed home from work under the guise of needing rest. She wanted to observe Ruth when she thought no one was watching. As the children played outside, Mrs. Angela quietly followed Ruth into the kitchen. She stood hidden behind the door, peeking through a small gap. Ruth was preparing lunch, her movements efficient but tense. Then, to Mrs. Angela's horror, Ruth paused, glanced around nervously, and did something unthinkable. Mrs. Angela's hand flew to her mouth as she watched Ruth lean over the pot of soup and urinate into it. Rage and disbelief coursed through her, but she forced herself to remain silent, retreating from the door before Ruth could notice her presence. Mrs. Angela's mind raced. She needed proof, and she needed to confront Ruth without alerting her. Later that evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Mrs. Angela served everyone, but discreetly told them not to eat. Ruth, she said calmly, her voice carrying a sharp edge. Can I see you in the kitchen for a moment? Ruth looked up, startled, but followed her employer into the kitchen. The tension in the room was palpable as Mrs. Angela closed the door behind them. What's going on, ma'am? Ruth asked nervously. Mrs. Angela turned to face her, her eyes blazing with restrained anger. Ruth, do you have something you want to tell me about the food you've been preparing? Ruth froze, her heart pounding. I don't understand, ma'am. You know exactly what I'm talking about, Mrs. Angela said, her voice rising slightly. I saw what you did today. I saw you, but I'm giving you the opportunity to confess now. Ruth's face turned pale and she stepped back, stammering. I didn't mean to what? Mrs. Angela interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. You've been living in this home. Mrs. Angela's voice trembled with anger as she spoke. You've lived in this house, eating our food, wearing clothes I bought for you. And this is how you repay us, by mistreating my children and doing this. Tears streamed down Ruth's face as she fell to her knees. I'm sorry, Mom. I was jealous. I've never had a family like this, and it made me angry. I wasn't thinking clearly. Please forgive me. Mrs. Angela stared at her heart heavy with betrayal. Ruth, I treated you like my own child. I gave you love and trust, and you've destroyed it. I need some time to think about what to do next. But for now, you will not go near the kitchen or my children. Do you understand? Ruth nodded, sobbing uncontrollably. Mrs. Angela left the kitchen, her mind reeling. She had shown Ruth nothing but kindness, yet jealousy had turned her into a stranger. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Ruth was given a room at the back of the house, isolated from the family, as Mrs. Angela tried to process the betrayal. The children, still unaware of the full extent of Ruth's actions, were kept away from her, and meals were prepared by Mrs. Angela herself. She had always believed in the power of kindness, but Ruth's actions made her question whether she had been too trusting. She had treated Ruth like family, yet now the walls of her home felt colder. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Mrs. Angela took a deep breath before speaking to Ruth. Ruth, I've decided to give you one last chance, she said calmly, her voice filled with both sorrow and firmness. You have hurt my children, and you betrayed my trust. But I believe people can change if they truly regret their actions and are willing to make amends. Ruth looked up, her face streaked with tears. I'm so sorry, Mom. I never meant to hurt anyone. I was just angry and bitter. I don't know what came over me. I understand, Mrs. Angela replied, but you need to prove that you are truly sorry. I can't trust you right away. You will need to earn back the love and respect of this household. From now on, there will be no more excuses. Do you understand? Ruth nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I understand, Mom. I'll do whatever it takes. Over the next few weeks, Ruth worked hard to regain the family's trust. She helped with the children's schoolwork, apologized to Bella, James, and Tommy, and did her best to treat them with kindness. Slowly, Mrs. Angela began to see small changes in her. Ruth became more respectful, more patient, and more humble than she had been before. After Ruth was accepted back into the household, Mrs. Angela tried her best to treat her as she always had, with kindness and understanding. However, Aunt Linda was far from convinced that this was the right decision. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Aunt Linda placed her fork on the table with a deliberate clink. Angela, she began, I still don't understand why you let Ruth stay after everything she did. How can you trust her again? What's to stop her from doing something even worse? Mrs. Angela sighed, looking across the table at her sister. Linda, I've thought about this a lot. Ruth is a young woman who made terrible choices, but she's also human. If we don't give her a second chance, who will? I can't live with myself knowing I turned her out with nowhere to go. What if she were family? Wouldn't you want someone to forgive you if you made a mistake? Aunt Linda shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. That's the problem, Angela. You're treating her like family, but she's not family. And even if she were, family doesn't always mean letting someone back into your life after they've betrayed you. You're being too soft. The room fell into an awkward silence. The children, sensing the tension, quietly focused on their plates, while Mr. David glanced between his wife and her sister, unsure whether to intervene. Mrs. Angela finally spoke, her voice firm. But gentle, Mrs. Angela replied softly yet firmly. I understand your concerns, Linda, and I appreciate that you're looking out for us. But I've made my decision. Ruth deserves another chance, and I won't turn my back on her. Aunt Linda let out a frustrated sigh, but decided to drop the argument for the time being. Fine, she muttered, picking up her fork again. But don't say I didn't warn you. Despite her outward resignation, Aunt Linda remained vigilant. She noticed the subtle changes in Ruth's behavior over time. Ruth smiled more often, went out of her way to be helpful, and seemed genuinely remorseful. But Aunt Linda wasn't convinced. She watched Ruth closely, noting every move she made, every interaction with the children, and every word she said to Mrs. Angela and Mr. David. Meanwhile, Mrs. Angela had let go of her initial caution. She saw Ruth's efforts and chose to believe in her transformation. She even began to praise Ruth for her hard work, brushing off Aunt Linda's occasional remarks about being overly trusting. Angela, you're letting your guard down too quickly, Aunt Linda said one afternoon. as they sat in the living room. I'm telling you, people don't change that easily. You need to be careful. Mrs. Angela waved her hand dismissively. Linda, I appreciate your concern, but I think Ruth has learned her lesson. Let's give her the benefit of the doubt. She's been through enough already. Aunt Linda frowned, but said nothing. Deep down, she knew Mrs. Angela's kindness was well intentioned, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Ruth wasn't as reformed as she appeared to be, determined to protect her sister's family. She resolved to keep watching Ruth, even if it meant doing so on her own. As the days turned into weeks, Ruth's initial remorse and apparent gratitude began to wane, replaced by a growing bitterness she could not fully understand. On the surface, she continued to perform her duties, smiling and responding politely to Mrs. Angela's kindness, but deep within her, resentment simmered. Whenever Ruth saw Bella, James, and Tommy laughing together or calling out to their parents with affection, she felt a sharp pang of jealousy. The children had everything she had never known: a loving home, parents who adored them, and a sense of security she had never experienced. Every cheerful giggle or playful shout grated on her nerves. Slowly, her resentment began to show in small, subtle ways. When Mrs. Angela left for work, Ruth would take the opportunity to vent her frustrations. She no longer spoke to the children with the same warmth she feigned in front of their parents. Instead, her tone was sharp and dismissive. Bella, stop making noise and sit down, she snapped one afternoon when the little girl was excitedly playing with her doll. But I'm not making noise, Ruth, Bella replied, her innocent eyes wide with confusion. Did I ask for an explanation? Just sit down, Ruth barked. The children grew uneasy around her, sensing the change in her demeanor, but they said nothing to their parents. Ruth was careful to cover her tracks. Whenever Mrs. Angela asked how the children were doing, she would smile sweetly and lie. They're doing fine, Mom, she'd say. They've been so well behaved. But behind closed doors, she would eat portions of their food and leave them with less, later telling Mrs. Angela that the children had eaten well. Her actions became more calculated as her resentment deepened. Ruth found twisted satisfaction in these small acts of sabotage, though she couldn't fully explain why. The children's laughter became a source of irritation she couldn't shake, and she found herself glaring at them whenever their backs were turned. One night, alone in her room, Ruth sat on her bed fuming. The shadows danced on the walls as her mind spiraled. The warmth of Mrs. Angela's kindness, the joy of the children, and the unshakable presence of Aunt Linda all felt like a taunt to her. Why them? She muttered under her breath. Why do they get everything while I have nothing? Her bitterness began to transform into a dangerous form of ambition. That night, Ruth began to think of ways to take control of the family she envied so much. She wanted what they had, and she wanted it for herself. But how? The thought consumed her as she began to plot. At first, her mind wandered to dark places. What if I poisoned Mrs. Angela? She thought, the idea flashing briefly through her mind. If she were gone, maybe Mr. David would need me more. Maybe I could take her place. But even in her rage, Ruth dismissed the idea. It was too dangerous, too extreme. She couldn't risk being caught. Besides, Mr. David was a cautious man. If Mrs. Angela were to fall ill or die suddenly, suspicion would certainly fall on her. Then, as she lay in the dim light of her room, another idea came to her, one that seemed more realistic, more achievable. What if I became indispensable to Mr. David? She whispered, a smile creeping across her lips. What if I had his child? If I gave him an heir, no one could push me away from this family. Not Mrs. Angela, not Aunt Linda, no one. The thought of having a child with Mr. David made her heart race, not from love, but from the power it represented. If she could tie herself to him in that way, she would never have to worry about being sent away. She would be more than just a housemaid. She would be family. Mind. First, she needed to catch Mr. David's attention. He was a respectful, disciplined man, always focused on his family and his work. Winning him over wouldn't be easy, but Ruth was determined. Over the next few days, Ruth began to change her behavior around Mr. David. When she was alone with him, she started to compliment him subtly. Mr. David, you look very sharp today, she said one morning as he prepared to leave for work. He glanced at her briefly, offering a polite smile. Thank you, Ruth. At first, he didn't seem to notice her efforts, but Ruth was persistent. She began wearing tighter, more revealing clothing, claiming they were gifts from a distant relative, Mrs. Angela, always quick to compliment, praised her for her new sense of style. I like the way you've been dressing lately, Ruth, she said one evening as they prepared dinner together. It's nice to see you taking care of yourself. Ruth smiled, hiding her satisfaction. Thank you, Mom. I just thought it was time for a change. Aunt Linda, however, was less impressed. She narrowed her eyes at Ruth and turned to Mrs. Angela. Angela, don't you think those clothes are a bit inappropriate? She's living in a family home. We should set some boundaries. Mrs. Angela waved her off. Oh, Linda, don't be so strict. She's a young woman. Let her enjoy herself a little. Aunt Linda's suspicions deepened, but she kept her thoughts to herself, deciding to observe Ruth more closely. Meanwhile, Ruth continued her subtle campaign to win over Mr. David. She made sure to be in his presence whenever possible, offering him tea, asking him about his work, and laughing a little too loudly at his jokes. She even started lingering in the living room after dinner, pretending to tidy up just so she could steal moments of conversation with him. But Ruth knew her plan needed more than subtle flirtation. She needed an opportunity, a moment when she could take things to the next level. Her plan was slowly taking shape. She knew she had to be subtle and patient if she wanted to manipulate Mr. David into falling for her. She couldn't be obvious about it, but Aunt Linda wasn't easily fooled. She had been observing Ruth closely ever since she returned to the household. Something about the young woman's demeanor didn't sit right with her, and now, seeing Ruth prance around the house in short skirts and tight tops, Aunt Linda was more convinced than ever that Ruth was up to something. One evening, while helping Mrs. Angela with the dishes, Aunt Linda decided to voice her concerns. Angela, don't you think Ruth's outfits are a bit inappropriate? I mean, this is a family home, not a fashion runway. Mrs. Angela glanced at her sister, surprised. Linda, you're always so critical. She's just expressing herself. She's young. Let her enjoy it, Angela, Aunt Linda pressed, lowering her voice. She's dressing like that in front of David. Don't you find that odd? A housemaid dressing like that? Mrs. Angela frowned but quickly shook her head. Linda, you're reading too much into this. Ruth has been through a lot. The least we can do is let her feel good about herself. Besides, David barely notices things like that. He's not that kind of man. That may be true, but you can't be blind to the fact that she's changed, Aunt Linda argued. I'm telling you, there's more to this than what we're seeing. Mrs. Angela sighed, wiping her hands on a dish towel. You're being too harsh. Ruth has been working hard to regain our trust. I think we should give her the benefit of the doubt. Frustrated, Aunt Linda decided to drop the conversation for now. She knew her sister's kind heart made it difficult for her to see the possibility of Ruth harboring ulterior motives. But Aunt Linda's instincts told her otherwise. From that point on, Aunt Linda made it her mission to uncover Ruth's true intentions. She began paying closer attention to her interactions with Mr. David and the children. She noticed how Ruth would linger in the living room when David was home, offering to bring him tea or asking him questions about his work one day while Mrs. Angela and the children were out. Aunt Linda decided to snoop through Ruth's room. She knew it was a bold move, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Ruth was hiding something. She waited until Ruth went to the market and slipped into her room. The space was tidy and unassuming, but Aunt Linda began searching through drawers and closets, looking for anything that might give her a clue. She found nothing unusual, just clothes, a few personal items, and some letters from Ruth's distant relatives. Frustrated, Aunt Linda left the room feeling no closer to uncovering the truth, but she wasn't ready to give up. I'll just have to keep watching her, she muttered to herself. Ruth, oblivious to Aunt Linda's suspicions, continued with her plan. She started to increase her interactions with Mr. David, making sure to be extra helpful when Mrs. Angela wasn't around. The morning of Mr. David's day off started with the usual bustle in the household. Ruth, feigning a headache, approached Mrs. Angela with a pitiful expression. "Mom, I'm so sorry, but I don't think I can take the children to the park today. I've been feeling dizzy since last night," she said, holding her head dramatically. "Oh no, Ruth, you should rest then," Mrs. Angela said with concern. "I'll take the children to the park myself. Aunt Linda, would you like to join us?" Aunt Linda hesitated. Her instincts told her something was off. Ruth's sudden sickness seemed too convenient, but she kept her thoughts to herself. "Come along," she said, giving Ruth a long, suspicious look. As they packed up for the outing, Aunt Linda noticed Ruth lingering in the background, her eyes darting towards Mr. David, who was sitting on the couch reading a newspaper. Aunt Linda's unease deepened, but she didn't say anything. Once they were on the road, Aunt Linda could no longer ignore her nagging doubts. Halfway to the park, she turned to Mrs. Angela. "I think I forgot something important at home. You go on ahead with the kids. I'll catch up later." Mrs. Angela raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? We can wait for you." "No, no, it's fine. I'll be quick," Aunt Linda insisted, already signaling the driver to halt the car. Back at the house, Aunt Linda walked in quietly, her eyes scanning the living room. It was eerily silent. She moved cautiously toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms, her heart pounding. As she approached the master bedroom, she heard faint movement inside. Pushing the door open, she froze at the sight before her. Ruth was on the bed, climbing on top of a deeply asleep Mr. David. His shirt was unbuttoned, and Ruth was leaning over him, murmuring something Aunt Linda couldn't make out. "Ruth, what in the world are you doing?" Aunt Linda shouted, her voice echoing through the room. Ruth spun around, her face a mask of panic. "He's sick. I was just checking on him." "Don't you dare lie to me," Aunt Linda snapped, storming into the room. She grabbed Ruth by the arm and yanked her off the bed. Ruth fought back, clawing at Aunt Linda and shouting incoherently, "Leave me alone. You don't understand." The commotion grew louder as the two women struggled. Aunt Linda was determined not to let Ruth escape, but Ruth was surprisingly strong, fueled by desperation. The noise caught the attention of the security guard outside, who rushed into the house to investigate. When he entered the bedroom, he found Aunt Linda pinning Ruth to the floor, her face flushed with effort. "Help me hold her," Aunt Linda shouted. The guard quickly restrained Ruth, who was still thrashing and screaming. Aunt Linda turned her attention to Mr. David, who remained motionless on the bed. His breathing was shallow, and a half-empty glass of juice sat on the nightstand. "He's been drugged," Aunt Linda muttered, her eyes narrowing at Ruth. The security guard called the police, and within minutes, officers arrived at the scene. They searched the room and found a small bottle of sleeping pills hidden under the bed. When they questioned Ruth, she broke down and confessed. "I just wanted him to notice me," she sobbed. "I didn't mean for things to go this far." Aunt Linda shook her head in disbelief. "You're despicable. After everything this family did for you, this is how you repay them?" As the police prepared to take Ruth away, they discovered a hidden camera in the corner of the room. Ruth had planted it to record her actions, hoping to use the footage to manipulate Mr. David later. Instead, the camera became damning evidence against her. Mrs. Angela arrived home with the children shortly after, only to be met with chaos. When she heard what had happened, she was overcome with shock and betrayal. "Oh, Ruth," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Linda shook her head in disbelief. "You're despicable. After everything this family did for you, this is how you repay them?" As the police prepared to take Ruth away, they discovered a hidden camera in the corner of the room. Ruth had planted it to record her actions, hoping to use the footage to manipulate Mr. David later. Instead, the camera became damning evidence against her. Mrs. Angela arrived home with the children shortly after, only to be met with chaos. When she heard what had happened, she was overcome with shock and betrayal. "Oh, Ruth," she cried, tears streaming down her face. We treat Linda shook her head in disbelief. You're despicable. After everything this family did for you, this is how you repay them? As the police prepared to take Ruth away, they discovered a hidden camera in the corner of the room. Ruth had planted it to record her actions, hoping to use the footage to manipulate Mr. David later. Instead, the camera became damning evidence against her. Mrs. Angela arrived home with the children shortly after, only to be met with chaos. When she heard what had happened, she was overcome with shock and betrayal. "Oh, Ruth," she cried, tears streaming down her face. We treat Linda shook her head in